if there was a godfather of the notorious beat movement in poetry in America, it would probably be Lawrence Ferlinghetti. He died only recently at the age of, I think, 101. So his lifetime spanned most of the 20th century, and he really interesting life. Kind of a tumultuous childhood with some insanity in the family. He was shopped around to different relatives and friends and stuff like that. He lived in Europe for a little while. He served in the Navy. He got himself into UNC Chapel Hill, and then did a doctorate at the Sorbonne in art history. Really interesting life. He settled eventually, after having grown up on the West Coast and lived in Europe for a little while. He settled eventually in San Francisco and was part of a burgeoning countercultural movement out there. And even in that, he was a little bit of an odd duck because he was a businessman. He was a small businessman. He started a small bookstore called City Lights Books. Dealing primarily in used books and stuff that was a little bit harder to get, not quite mainstream, but serious literature and interesting literature, not just the classics. He became a publisher as well in that. Again, a kind of a entrepreneurial spirit in him. And he began publishing his own work and that of others, and it was through that he started to become quite the beat figure. He always insisted that he was not a beat poet. He was not of that ilk, and he was a little bit older than the rest of them, and obviously a little more settled and sedentary, but sober certainly. But his poetry bears many distinct characteristics of that style and that era. Paramount in his work would be a collection that he self-published, a work called Coney Island of the Mind. This is my copy, autographed by him. There you go, right there. Came out in 1958, and it works in the beat ethos of influenced by jazz and bebop music of the time, a kind of funky countercultural stance to it that thumbs its nose at a lot of establishment culture, but at the same time probes very deeply questions of what it means to be human, what it means to be alive. The most popular work in there, and probably one of his best, is one that is called what has come to be known as Sometime During Eternity. He did not title it that. You can see in his book, he just numbers rather than titles. So you have his book, and each poem, each new element within it gets its own number, but not necessarily a title, whatever he's trying to prove with that. But it lays out in the very idiosyncratic, yes, beat style, a portrait of the world and of some sacred idols within that world, that is a curious reflection on them and on the act of viewing and considering and, yes, worshiping those idols. Sometime during eternity, some guys show up, and one of them, who shows up real late, is a kind of carpenter from some square-type place like Galilee, and he starts wailing and claiming that he is hip to who made heaven and earth, and that the cat who really laid it on us is his dad. And moreover, he adds, it's all writ down on some scroll-type parchments which some henchmen leave lying around the Dead Sea somewheres a long time ago, and which you won't even find for a couple of 1,000 years or so, or at least for 1,947 of them to be exact, and even then nobody really believes them, or me for that matter. You're hot, they tell him, and they cool him, and they stretch him on the tree to cool. And everybody after that is always making models of this tree with him hung up and always crooning his name and calling him to come down and sit in on their combo as if he is the king cat who's got to blow or they can't quite make it. Only they don't come down from his tree. Him just hang there on his tree, looking real petered out and real cool, and also, according to a roundup of late world news from the usual unreliable sources, real dead. Now, significantly, this is laid out in a very curious and irregular pattern. Again, kind of bizarre in its orthography, let's say, in its layout. There's no punctuation. There's no there's some irregular capitalization, and some of the language is obviously straining for quite, I would say self-mockingly, that kind of hepcat feel that comes from the jazz culture of the late 50s, the stereotypical beat poet, black turtleneck wearing, beret wearing, cigarette smoking beats, where everything is a somewhat awkward appropriation, let's say, of a staple of African American culture, appropriated by white college students, quite frankly. And there is something kind of self-mocking in that he is taking on one of the most serious subjects in Western literature, in Western art, and Western culture, the crucifixion of Christ, and talking about it in this, jive way, in this hepcat way, that sounds kind of ridiculous. But it comes down to the reality at the end of, well, he just stays up there, him hang on the tree, looking real petered out. And of course, his tree is capitalized to emphasize that now this is his tree. The tree, of course, is the cross, and looking real petered out. A pun on Saint Peter. It's having some fun with this. But I think that's part of the point. I think it's not a mocking of Christianity so much as a mocking of the attitude towards it. And in this moment, even that moment, however, the most essential moment, well, okay, I'm not getting into doctrine, but essential moment of Christianity is the crucifixion. And that arresting of the attention in that moment, according to the usual roundup of late world news from the usual unreliable sources, real dead. There's an odd abstraction there. First of all, he's only going with usual unreliable sources, real dead. So he's abstracting it through, well, okay, this is what I hear. I don't know this for sure myself, which is a question of faith, of course. And the question of, well, according to them, he was real dead. But by the basis of faith, he's not dead. Because the basis of faith in Christianity, of course, is based on his Jesus Christ's resurrection and eternal life in heaven. So he's not dead. But this pose seems to be poking fun at a kind of jaundiced view of that, where you're sort of making fun of something, but he's really kind of making fun of the character who would speak like that, who is sort of being that hepcat character. He wrote a lot in that vein, so this is something that he participated in. But I think he always has this nuanced relationship to it, where again he's saying, while being while publishing the beats and while writing stuff that is so characteristically beat poet-ish and help put the stamp on what beat poetry is, he's got this uncertain relationship with it. So you're not quite sure how seriously to take him in any particular mode of that. And that gives you a little bit of a uncertainty. It puts you in this so-called liminal space of interpreting what he's saying and not being able to take him seriously. But if you take that and transpose it onto the Bible, he's suggesting maybe the same thing, that we are not supposed to necessarily take it so seriously. We should question it. We should try and relate to it on its own terms, but we can't have any real certainty as to how we should read it. The tone might be unreliable. The tone might be a little too irreverent or a little too reverent, but we need to come to an original understanding of the text on our own terms. We need to dig into it for ourselves, not take somebody's reported approach to it, whether it is the late world news, who are unreliable, or the original sources who might have their own agenda in writing the Gospels, or we can just ruminate, perhaps, on the meaning of that and try and read into them what the real significance is for ourselves as individuals, and not just take what everybody tells us it means as significant. We need to strip away that and come to an original and heartfelt appreciation of the meaning of Christianity, the meaning of the crucifixion. And so he estranges it. He makes it seem kind of odd. He just takes that holy relic of the cross and the crucifixion and casts a peculiar eye on it. Again, in a kind of formalist mode, he estranges it. He makes it alien, and he makes you think about it kind of twice and say, well, what really was that about? Stripping away all of the reverence, all of the idol worship of the text itself, and trying to get at the meaning within the text, trying to find something that pulses within the words, which is part and parcel what beat poetry largely tries to do, to strip away the appearances of calm everyday culture and find something thriving within, find some sort of primordial energy within the accumulated dreck of culture. And this is where the poem really shines. You can look at it as a kind of tongue-in-cheek experiment. You can look at it as him just being a little bit of a goof. You can look at it as maybe he is, genuinely mocking the crucifixion and the obsession with Christ, but taken as a element of history, and he's burying it in history, citing very specifically the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls just like 10 years before this was written, as an indication of, well, okay, we have this new textual element, the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have this new textual element, and we're trying to learn how to read it. We are trying to not only translate it, but destructure it a little and find out what it means. And that implies a new way of reading, a new relationship to the text, a new sense of what it means to read something. And so he's pitching this in a very specific time and place. At the tail end of the 1950s, before the upheaval of the 60s, he is sounding a certain alarm about counterculture, about the plastic surface of conformist culture in America, and giving a note to a kind of authenticity, or a striving for authenticity, that we all need to engage in, to strip away the tonal playfulness, or the goofy sometimes language. for that matter. They tell him you're hot, and you're hot. They tell him, and they cool him. That's kind of a groaner, but that sense of casting a new eye on something significant and trying to get at it from a new angle, to develop an individual relationship with a text and meaning that is sometimes elusive, to not take the form as the everything, but to find within it a kind of thriving content that will maybe make the form make sense.